Good afternoon and welcome to Blueprint for Clean Energy, a webinar speaker series hosted by the Yale Center for Business and the Environment. My name is Shwendu, and today's webinar will be on solar financing at Sol Systems. The Blueprint for Clean Energy webinar series invites leading practitioners and researchers in the field of clean energy to talk about the latest opportunities and developments in corporate, nonprofit, and public-private arenas. Joining us today is Krisztina Pjeczka, a structured finance senior associate at Sol Systems. She graduated in 2018 from the Yale School of the Environment, where she focused on the intersection of energy, business, and the environment. Today, Krisztina will discuss Sol Systems' approach to solar financing and development, the current challenges and opportunities the industry faces from her vantage point, and the company's recently announced partnership with Microsoft to bring online 500 megawatts of new solar power with a focus on environmental and social justice. She will also touch on the company's mission-driven culture and will highlight roles that students with MEM and MBA degrees and other similar backgrounds may find fulfilling. Krisztina, we are very excited to have you here and thank you for joining us. Before we begin, I'd like to make a few quick announcements. First, CBA's Financing and Deploying Clean Energy Certificate Program will begin accepting applications for the next cohort on January 11th, 2021. It is a year-long admissions-based online certificate program that equips rising leaders with the tools they need to accelerate the transition to a clean economy. You can learn more at cba.yale.edu/certificate. Second, we would like to remind our listeners that we welcome any questions you may have, and we'll direct them to Krisztina at the end of the talk. Please type your questions directly into the Q&A window throughout the presentation. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Krisztina. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Krisztina Pjeczka. And as Shram mentioned, I'm a senior associate at structured finance at Sol Systems, a DC-based solar financing and development group. I'm also an FES alum, or YSE, I guess, as call it now. I'm so very excited to be back and speaking to you. I also worked at CBA, so it's great to be back in with this crowd. So thanks for having me. So for a quick snapshot of what I've prepared for today's discussion, I'll give you a quick intro again and how I got here, and then I highlight a couple of trends in solar energy from where I sit for technology policy, finance, and project development. I'll then delve into our company's history and business lines and what my team, the fund and asset management team, does specifically. And we'll touch on the partnership that Sean mentioned as well, that we recently launched with Microsoft. And then we can talk jobs in solar as well. Great. So as I mentioned, I graduated from FES in 2018. I got to where I decided to come back to school for this degree back in 2015 when I was working at World Resources Institute, a DC-based think tank, and I was working on a paper for the internationally determined contributions of countries that they were putting forward to the Paris Climate Accord. And I really loved the topic and sort of the big picture thinking, but I realized I really wanted to understand more how these ambitious greenhouse gas emission targets will translate into on-the-ground action. And at the same time, a lot of people around me were saying how exciting it was that corporations are finally more part of the conversation now. They have a seat at the table. And we're really excited to have them on board really and use their leverage for climate action. So at this point, I had an undergrad degree in econ and environmental studies, but I had no idea how to read a balance sheet or how to speak the language of business. So that's why I came back to Yale and focused on the sort of intersection of business and energy. So I took classes at forestry school and then at SOM as well. And now I'm fortunate and grateful that I get to use basically all that on a daily basis. I sit in, or I focus on project origination. So I sit on the very front end of the project lifecycle at my company. So my job is to answer the question, what makes a solar project a good investment, and then find them. So it's a very dynamic, very fun job. I need to learn a lot about markets, our investment criteria that's constantly changing, the players that are changing. So it's a very dynamic job. So a couple of recent trends in solar, and by no means this is an exhaustive list. But to start with, every now and then, I really like to remind myself of just the incredible potential that solar power has to meet our needs and more, but also how minuscule its portion is in comparison to the other energy sources we are using to meet our energy needs in the world. And also, if you see on the Sankey diagram, we are wasting a lot of this in the energy conversion process. If you look at the rejected energy, gray box on the top right, we have a lot to do still to increase our efficiency. And this is not a crowd that I need to remind, of course, of the urgency of our action, but it's a good reminder every now and then when, you know, at whatever job you get really bogged down into the details and nitty-gritty of the work. We're doing this for climate action. So for key trends in solar, I would point out sort of the 3 key pillars that really drive solar deployment: technology, finance, and policy. For the technology piece, the obvious 2 key trends are cost declines and technology or performance improvement. So on this slide, you can see the cost breakdown of system costs by residential, non-residential, so C&I, municipal, and utility projects. And in the dark blue, you see the module cost, for example. That's an interesting one to look at because this already includes the impact of solar tariffs, the Section 201 tariffs that the Trump administration imposed on modules. So even with that additional sort of headwind, we are at a very good cost at the moment for solar. My company focuses on the last 2, so utility scale solar, mostly for tracking whenever possible. Then this graph is sort of the quintessential technology cost indicator, the LCOE that compares levelized cost of energy, that compares technologies that might have very different upfront and ongoing costs. So here and puts it on a level playing field. So here you can see how solar started off as being one of the most expensive electricity generating sources. Back in 2009, we were about $350, $60 per megawatt hour, and it just had the most dramatic drop all the way down to $37 per megawatt hour today, which is the lowest cost for electricity generation at the moment. For policy, there's a lot to talk about. I would look at the different layers here. We have federal, regional, state, and local policies that kind of all interact and push and pull another and affect solar deployment in different ways. On the federal level, we have the ITC, the investment tax credit, that has been a huge boost to solar deployment. There's talk it might be extended next year with the new administration, since it's already in a phase down, and with COVID, there have been a number of difficulties with meeting certain dates and construction dates and all that to qualify for it. So that could be on the table. Tariffs, as I mentioned, might be reversed or changed, or we'll have to see with the new administration. And FERC, of course, on the federal level, regulates interstate electricity matters. So a number of recent rules like that impact battery participation in capacity markets and things like that have significant impact on solar for storage development. On the regional level, I would call out the just very stark difference between regulated and deregulated markets. So in ISO RTO territories is where the vast majority of solar development happens, simply because you have access to a competitive wholesale market. In utility monopoly power states, the rest of the regulated states, it is still possible, obviously, to do solar, but it's a lot more complicated. PURPA, the 1970s rule, was one tool that a lot of developers like us use as well. The state level, we have renewable portfolio standards, net metering rules for behind the meter storage and rebates that are aiding solar or not. We can talk about that as well. And then on the local side, permitting is something that I think a lot of developers and investors in the space did not necessarily think about as much, or at least where I stood sort of later on in the project lifecycle, that wasn't necessarily the case. But the more successful we are, I think it's my hypothesis, the more we'll run into this issue, because we do take up more and more space. Solar is a land intensive and very visual technology. So getting zoning permits and planning permits is something that now we have to really think about more, and sort of get that local buy-in in a number of areas more than we might have before. Here's just a sort of more like positive, impressive map of the state level action that we see across the states in the face of federal inaction. So states are really stepping up and trying to push clean energy regulation through on the state level. So a couple of places I would call out. New York is one state that I love following, because there's just so much happening in the state. They also, for example, have a 6 gigawatt DG target by 2025. One of the ways they are trying to get there is through a very innovative value stacking incentive structure for community solar projects. That's something that's fueled a lot of development in the state. And NYSERDA, the local research agency, puts out a lot of like grants and awards and different programs like every other week. I would definitely sign up for their newsletters. New Jersey, Maryland and Virginia are two other states where recent clean energy laws were passed, which is very exciting. They impact the development differently. In Virginia, it's very interesting that you have basically just two major utilities, Dominion and APCO. So the power dynamics there is a little different than in other states. Maine is another interesting one. Maine went from a completely overlooked state in terms of renewables to overnight to a hotspot of development with the new governor that came in and passed RPS increases and other incentive programs. It's a very fun state to follow as well. And another tricky one, or sort of a different flavor for renewable news, Ohio. I'm not sure if any of you on the call are following the news there, but currently there is an investigation going on, because it turns out a recent bill that was passed last year, HB 6, that was basically a nuclear bailout bill. They also gutted renewable incentives, and the RPS in the state was the result of a bribery. So now they're investigating that, and it might lead to the RPS being reinstated. So there might be more support for renewables in that state. So there's more in about all these states that we could talk about, that just some highlights I wanted to bring up. For finance, so I would start with saying that the typical capital stack, so kind of roughly the capital stack that looks kind of like this for solar. So you have 40% tax equity, 40% debt, and 20% sponsor equity. This is, of course, just in the US, since we are the only country that tries to incentivize renewables through the tax code. So tax equity, it's a very tricky, complicated portion of the stack, but a very important one. A couple of key highlights from recent months with COVID. A lot of companies are questioning their profitability and sort of scrutinizing deals a lot more. There's a quote unquote flight to quality. People are really much valuing existing relationships and quality deals. And of course, the ITC is stepping down. So we are, there are a lot of discussions about trying to safe harbor the ITC, which we can come back to in a bit, but that's a reality we have to contend with. For that, we have historically low interest rates across the board that impacts solar as well. But at the same time, also we have a proven technology with stable cash flows, so that all that leads to cheap, abundant debt for the most part. At the same time, with COVID, liquidity challenges are real as well. So there's sort of that check on the debt market. And then sponsor equity is interesting. Equity is, as usual, the riskiest piece, typically the hardest to come by. And it's the bottom of the cash water flow for all deals. However, there have been a huge wave of new entrants into the sponsor equity market in the US, often from foreign investors who have very low cost of capital and are just looking for slightly higher yields here with solar. That again is a proven asset class. So it has become a great target of investors from all stripes. And there's also sort of a side mark here, a lot of M&A activity, not just for projects, but entire development platforms and development companies as well. So all this comes together, all these different trends lead to deployment. So on this graph, you can see that since, let's say 2013, solar, which for some reason is represented in dark blue instead of yellow on this graph, has been at least 25% of new additional electricity generating capacity. And together with wind, which is in green, we have the majority of new additions coming from renewables. And then on this graph, you see just solar alone and sort of also overlaid with solar prices dropping. We are just above $1 per watt AC for solar across the board, which is just a beautiful drop again across the years here. One interesting thing that I would point out on this graph is that you can see the interplay between policy and finance and deployment here in the spike in 2016, which happened because the ITC was about to be expired in 2015. So a lot of developers and project owners, investors pushed projects to start construction in safe harbor, so be able to still claim the 30% ITC in 2015, and then those actually came online in 2016. We might be seeing something similar in the next coming years, since the ITC is already in a phase down right now. So all this is great, but of course, challenges abound, as in any industry. So a couple I would call out are interconnection, permitting, insurance, and land impacts large. So for interconnection, I'd say there is a disconnect between a lot of states, legislature, and sort of local policies to push clean energy and the ability or willingness of electric utilities in the states to interconnect those new generating technologies in a timely fashion. So one example I gave is in Massachusetts. Last year, National Grid, one of the largest utilities in the state, pulled almost a gigawatt worth of solar capacity from their queue, some of which were very advanced, almost ready to turn on and start generating electricity and revenue for investors. And they pulled all those together for a quote unquote cluster study. They basically wanted to make sure that the aggregate impact of this new generation on the transmission grid would be feasible and manageable. And this, of course, introduced huge delays, costs for some as well, additional costs, and just uncertainty for developers and investors alike. So a lot of companies like ours decided to not enter the Massachusetts market as a result. And this, I don't think, would be unique to Massachusetts. I think this will be something we'll have to face elsewhere as well, and we are already to certain degrees in other states as well. So we'll have to solve the interconnection piece. Permitting, as I mentioned, local permits are trickier and trickier to come by. Where it really depends very much on NIMBYism, on misinformation potentially, or asymmetric information in certain communities. To a certain degree, though, to jump to the last point, and then the impacts, it is true that solar is a land-intensive technology, so we do have to do our best to mitigate the land impacts for our development. So that's something that the industry is sort of coming around to see, and we are doing pollinator-friendly habitat creation and other similar initiatives, which I can come back to in a bit as well. But that's a key consideration here. And then lastly, insurance. Climate change is working against us, which is a bit ironic since we are trying to mitigate climate change with our work. But with the increased frequency and severity of natural catastrophes, hurricanes, wildfires, flooding, insurance companies are hurting. They are paying out more than they expected. So they are now trying to spread those costs across other policy holders, and that means that includes us as well, solar project owners. So our premiums are increasing and our coverage is decreasing. So what used to be an afterthought for underwriting, project due diligence way later in the process, this insurance piece is now a very integral part of the project origination process as well. So very early on, when we are looking in my position for a new project in a new state, we have to consider whether it will get a reasonable insurance quote or not. So we are staying away from coastal sites, we're staying away from hurricane country, we're staying away from California for wildfires and things like that. So it's getting tricky. I'm hoping that there will be some intervention there at some point. All right, so let's dive into what my company does and a couple of recent programs we have. So Solar Systems, as I mentioned, is a DC-based company. We have a few people working remotely in the country. We are about 80 people, full-time employees, and we started in 2008. So the company has three main business units. We started with our trading arm in 2008. So our founders realized that there was a business opportunity in aggregating and trading solar renewable energy credits that homeowners were receiving for their rooftop solar bills in DC and other places as well. And that part of the business then grew out to be broader in scope. So they are now trading wind tracks as well, carbon and electricity as well. Then in 2012 or so, we started with what now became our on-site solar development arm. So they mostly focus on CNI, municipal, university, hospital, audience. So basically go out and ask FedEx, Amazon, Walmart, whether they want cheaper, more reliable electricity that's also clean. And the answer is increasingly yes. So they structure those power purchase agreement, the leases and the like. They recently formed a joint venture with Capital Dynamics, one of the largest asset owners in the US/the world, to then own these assets once they are through the development lifecycle. And then my team is the third part of the company, which is the fund and asset management team. We started also around 2012 as a tax equity syndicating platform. So we invested and have been investing tax equity on behalf of tax advantage investor clients into projects that needed that upfront capital. So since 2012, we invested over $350 million worth of tax equity capital. So it was just around 2015 when the ITC was about to expire that one of our longstanding clients, Nationwide Insurance, realized that they really liked the asset class. They wanted to stay in solar, and seeing that the ITC was about to go away, they started thinking of other options. And that's how eventually we launched a sponsor fund with them. So they now moved from the tax equity side of the capital stack to the sponsor side, and they gave us $100 million worth of equity to then deploy into solar across the US that needed a list of criteria. So we did. In the last 2 years, we deployed that money into 3 portfolios let me show you the map, in North Carolina, Texas, and Louisiana. So we have used up the first tranche of capital, and now are launching our new fund with new investors for an even larger allocation. And I wanted to show you all just a snapshot into the solar project lifecycle and pull out a couple of things that happen, key actions and actors that carry out these development activities at each stage, and then the financing that's available there. So typically, you start off a solar project by having a couple of guys and gals and a truck, finding some suitable land that is not too slopey, not full of wetlands, not too wooded. It's the perfect clean brownfield, let's say. And you want to make sure you're not too far from a good interconnection site as spot on the grid either. So you get the lease option, you get the forward purchase option from the landowner, and you submit your interconnection to the local utility. After that, if everything goes through, it's looking good, you get permits. You get binary permits. So some like zoning permits are yes or no. You either get it or the project is done at that point. And then you get other permits where you just have to make sure you comply with local regulations. They do site studies at this point, making sure that you are accounting for wetlands, you're accounting for floodplains, you're not endangering species on the site and the like. And then a key part here is offtake negotiations. So you find your buyer who is eventually going to give you revenue, because up until this point you only have costs and liabilities. So it's a key piece. And this is typically where my company would come in. Then we find the project at this stage, at least until now, and then we finance it. So the project financing piece comes next, where we bring the sponsor equity from our sponsor fund, and then we structure tax equity and structure debt, construction and term debt for the project. And then this is where you also pull in the insurance piece and a couple of others that you'll need to make sure the project is viable. Then the project goes through construction with an EPC, engineering, procurement, construction company, operations, and asset management during operations, O&M asset management group, and asset management group make sure everything is fine with the project. Let's say it gets hit by a hurricane, like one of our sites did. They deploy the troops, make sure everything is fixed and the project carries on. And then at the end of its life, the site is decommissioned, which can be after 20, 30, even 40 years now. And then I just called out a couple of spots here where potential acquisition could happen. So some developers only take projects to mid-stage and then they sell it to a larger developer. Some take it all the way to operations, or there are a number of other flavors in between. So Soul, sort of as a broad, just to say, take a step back and look at Soul as sort of a company at large. We do solar, so I like to think that our core business is very sustainable and it's producing positive impacts in society. So we also do a comprehensive set of solutions. We are doing trading, we're doing on-site solar for smaller sites, and we're doing off-site larger sites as well. But on top of that, we are also focused on corporate sustainability initiatives and justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, JEDI initiatives as well, both at the company and beyond as well, to make solar and solar finance a more inclusive workforce. So the one place where all these three things come together the most is our recent initiative with Microsoft. We've been working on this for a while, but we just recently announced that in the summer that we are going to be deploying or acquiring and then building and operating 500 megawatts of solar for Microsoft to buy the electricity from by 2025, which is when Microsoft's ambitious carbon goals kick in. And we have a number of layers to this partnership that make it unique. First of all, actually the next slide is the better one for that. So we are looking at site selection, project impact, and community reinvestment. So for all these 500 megawatts of solar, we are going to be paying special attention to where we're siting them to start with, or which projects we acquire if it's already in development when we come to it. So we are going to give preference to sites that are in communities that are under-resourced or have been disproportionately impacted by pollution. And then for these sites, we'll do site remediation during construction and operations as well. So as I said, so we're pollinator friendly habitat creation and other site remediation depending on the needs of the site. We'll also be boosting the local tax base, giving lease revenue to landowners in these areas as well. And then one other key piece that we're working a lot on now is the community reinvestment piece. So we are going to be reinvesting 10% of our revenues into these communities that we developing, and this will be sort of used through or dispersed through a fund that will be mostly focused on energy access, energy justice initiatives, workforce development for clean energy jobs as well, and other environmental and energy initiatives that local groups that we are working side by side with are advised that they would have to the biggest impact in these communities. Great. Well, for the last piece, you see I'm speaking pretty fast. I just wanted to call out a few things for solar. So I would say there is a place for everyone in this industry. As I said in the beginning with that diagram on the different energy sources we are using currently, that we need to go faster. We need to do a whole lot more. So please, if you're interested, there's a place for you. But when you're looking at specific jobs, I would consider function, where you would be sitting in the project lifecycle, and the type of work you're doing is very different based on that. The position of your company in the industry, corporate culture. You want to be able to enjoy, the majority of your waking hours that you spend at work, and then be able to bring your whole self. Keeping up with the market. There's just so much going on. So keep, that running list of newsletters that you consult, and expect a solar coaster. It's our way of saying there are a lot of ups and downs on a daily basis in the market, but it's a lot of fun, and it's for good fun. So enjoy it. Great. Well, that's what I have prepared, but I'm very much looking forward to your questions. I realize I spoke really fast. I hope I wasn't too fast.
Great. Thank you so much, Krisztina. I guess we can start off with a question about what are some of the key technical and soft skill sets and conceptual understandings or frameworks that are required to land a clean energy structured finance role?
Great question. Let's see. Well, I would say that I think the core of the business really is technology and the finance piece. And then you need the policy, and you need project managers, and you need marketing and communication. So it's a lot of different pieces that all kind of have to pull together. But if you have your technical skills, either the financing or the technology piece, you are golden. Like, you have that foundation that you can build on. So for most of our work, we use project finance models. So understanding the sort of the mechanics of that is a skill that I think helps everyone on the team, even if you're not in that model on a daily basis. And you just maybe see the results, but you want to kind of be able to like manipulate it here and there if you need it. And then understanding some technical, the technical buildup of solar, or sort of how different pieces work together. You don't have to be an actual engineer necessarily for the most part, unless you're, of course, in that role. But that's a very helpful skill as well. And then you learn a lot on the job too. But for conceptual frameworks and all, I would say what I really have found interesting and exciting on a daily basis is that there's a lot of systems thinking going on. And this is like, what we talk about at school, systems thinking, this and that, like this. There's so many examples for any given project for solar that's actually very, reaffirming to see that this is a real skill, like that you've been able to kind of connect the dots. You're seeing how a policy change could impact financing and how public perception could impact development, and how you have to kind of pull all those levers together to eventually get to a successful project. And then at the same time, we have all these macro trends going on, both from financing. There are like a lot of corporate mergers going on, like what's going on with COVID now. How is that going to impact the availability of capital for my projects, things like that. Like there's just a lot of that sort of web like thinking, systems thinking that's going on. So I would encourage you to look for examples for that.
Great. Can you say more about what Sol Systems looks for in an ideal solar project site? Have you used satellite or aerial data for siting in the past, or is site selection mostly done by in-person field visits?
Great question. So I should have explained more. My team does not do greenfielding. So we come in. If you remember that slide with the project lifecycle, so we would typically come in at the third stage, so the financing stage. So at this point, the site is already developed. So we, like with some other, like another developer already used the satellite data, already looked at, all the different criteria that you need to find the suitable land, suitable interconnection spots and all that. But we do diligence that. So I can tell you that, what we look for is sites that are relatively flat, because it turns out slopes are harder to build on, and especially for trackers, which is a huge boost to energy yield. So the solar, your ability to extract solar with your technology is, way significantly improved with tracker technology than just fixed still. So you need nice and flat land for that, and you need interconnection to be reasonable. So you have to do a lot of digging around to make sure that the grid around the site that you picked or that you're considering is not overloaded. There are not like huge generating sources around, or others coming online because they're already on the queue. So you can see that, all the information. Or maybe on the flip side, there's a coal plant that's shutting down nearby. That can be a great benefit to you because you have this extra capacity on the grid that's now not used. So things like that you have to consider early on. And then next, site studies is something you can already see that kind of early on as well. If the site will be problematic for permitting and for studies, so you want to stay away from wetlands and floodplains. Although we did learn that some technologies or some solar can actually withstand some flooding. We have a site in a partially floodplain area in Louisiana, but for the most part, you try to stay away from that. And so kind of all these pieces have to all come together. And of course, even site control, like typically you need a number of landowners to participate. So, I mean, ideally you would only have, one lease, one person to deal with, but that's typically not the case, especially for larger projects. So you have to put it all together. And then sometimes you need an extra easement to get to your interconnection point that's beyond your land piece that you're leasing for the solar site itself. But that you have to consider whether that's feasible to get or not. Whether you have to permit that separately, things like that.
Thanks, Krisztina. And how do you deal with the tension between forest and farmland preservation and the need for utility scale solar? And what do you see as the eventual mix of distributed generation versus utility scale solar development? And how does cost play a role in that?
Great question. And a question that I think a lot of us in the industry are discussing and thinking about a lot. There is an inherent tension between solar development and other land uses. That's no doubt. I think in some areas, farmers that you would like to lease their farmland are actually benefiting a lot from the added lease rates, and in that case, that's not a negative conversion and land use change from their perspective, and they were not maybe getting out of the business already, or there are other dynamics going on there. For basically all other lands or just land in general, I would say we are trying to use as much or give as much preference to ecologically depleted lands as much as possible. So for the Microsoft partnership as well, that's a key consideration when we're looking at sites. So brownfields, landfills even, although that's tricky when you ask our engineering team, but it's possible. Those are, I think, the sites that my company and sort of the industry at large should go for. And obviously that's limited in size, but there's a lot that we can use, like a lot of land like that we can develop on the built environment, obviously rooftops and all, for distributed generation. So that's where that piece comes in. To your question, I think DG is a lot easier to do in a way that mitigates land impacts, because you can put it on the built environment, on rooftops and carports and other surfaces that are already impermeable and are just not natural ecosystems. So you're not disturbing there or anything. So that's a balance I think we're still figuring out as well.
We have a related question about low impact solar development, and examples include using native vegetation instead of removing vegetation from a site, or using livestock grazing as a form of maintenance. Is Sol Systems looking into these types of opportunities to reduce emissions from the construction and operations phases of projects?
Yes, we are. We are doing all of that. Native vegetation, grazing, I think, is on the list. We haven't done it yet. We are doing at one site, our development team is in Illinois, for example, where the construction will be 100% net zero waste. So they're recycling all their waste during construction. So we are experimenting, we are researching, and we are actually already implementing some of these techniques.
Great. And what role can community choice aggregation play in developing more solar projects?
Great question. So that's CCAs are not something our company has participated in, but personally, I would say that any business model innovation like a CCA, any other sort of setup where you involve the public more in choosing their energy source is a step forward. So community solar is another form of that we have looked at and almost acquired a couple of sites that would have been with community solar optics. So I'm very much in support. But as I said, we haven't directly worked with CCAs.
Do you foresee any regional or state markets opening up over the next few years? This person's company is looking to purchase more renewable energy, and they are hoping for positive market developments in Virginia in particular.
State markets opening up. I wonder what exactly you mean by that, but Virginia is in the PJM interconnection. So one of the largest wholesale market in the US. So it is a competitive market with a twist, since I mentioned they have a strong presence from Dominion, the IOU, the investor-owned utility in the state. But I believe that with the new law that was passed for the Clean Economy Act last year, there's a lot more choice or a lot more opportunities for companies to participate in the clean energy economy in Virginia as well. And you can do virtual PPAs in Virginia just as before as well. But to address that question more broadly, there are rumblings of other markets opening up, like the South, For example, there have been discussions that the Southern RTO, that's the Southern Wholesale Market, could open up, which would be very much welcome by our community because it would aid solar development. But of course, there are a lot of tensions between what third-party owners and developers want and what monopoly power utilities want. Obviously, they don't want to give up too much power, so that is still in discussions, and it seems like we might not get as much of an improvement there than we were hoping for, but this is still an ongoing discussion.
Thanks. So when looking at predictions or projections for future energy costs, do you guys do your own research or rely on third parties like S&P?
We rely on third parties. We use a combination of data sources, mostly from APP and WoodMac, third-party, proprietary data sources.
All right. And what is your medium-term forecast or your medium-term assumptions on storage? Are you investing in solar plus storage projects? And do you think that valuation of storage solutions has inflated to a point that complicates financing?
Interesting question. We have not invested, my team hasn't invested in solar just yet. We did look at a number of sites that had storage attached to it. I think what is complicated is that you have so many different ways to value storage, and it really also depends on the market you're in. So we've seen areas where you just had an adder on the PPA that was pretty straightforward, and then the utility was buying the power, knew that what they wanted to use that storage capacity for, so they could simplify it on our end for the PPA and the valuation piece. But in other cases, you have a lot more hoops to go through or to understand really how you can make the most of the benefits that storage can provide. So you have ancillary services, you can participate in capacity markets, you have a number of other ways to gain revenue from it, but it really is market specific. So I know our development team actually has now 2, I think, storage engineers, specialists who are focusing on that. I think for now they're looking at behind the meter, but don't quote me on that. I think they might be doing for the meter as well at this point. But we are looking into the many different ways storage can be it's definitely coming. The prices are dropping, and there's a need for it as well.
Thank you, Krisztina. What types of skills, perspectives, tools, approaches, relationships, etc., are necessary to really shift and push the solar market towards equity and justice?
Very good question. Yeah, I think for one, we need to listen more. For example, with the Microsoft partnership, we are working with NGOs that know a lot more about the on-ground realities of the communities that they work in. So we are trying to listen more and understand what is needed and how could we help best, and not assume that we know the answer. We know solar, but we don't know a number of other things. So putting those two together, I think, is the first step. And I think working to diversify solar finance, especially to technology and finance, to very male-dominated industries, into just a lot more representative, a lot more diverse workforce, is something that will help us make better decisions and understand the reality, on the ground reality more as well. So we are working towards that goal.
Great. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about Sol Systems' involvement in the newly formed Diversity and Inclusion Initiative called Renewables Forward, And that was created by CEOs from leading renewable energy companies and industry organizations. And Soul Systems is one of the participants in that initiative.
Yeah, this is a recent initiative that our company is involved in and helped launch. I think we are still learning a lot about it, but a couple of things that I know are key parts of it is, for example, unconscious bias trainings for people in the industry, and for new entrants, internship and other mentorship programs as well. So we're trying to focus both on the existing workforce and make it more inclusive. And we are trying to increase the pipeline of new solar workers that are more diverse into our industry as well.
Great, thanks, Krisztina. We still have a lot more questions left, and I don't know how many more you want to take, but
sure.
As long as you're comfortable taking more, I can keep going.
Sure.
Great. What would your perfect partners in community investment and development look like?
Perfect partners in community investment?
Mm-hmm.
Well, as I mentioned, I think we are working with some already that are great partners because they can give us a perspective that we lack from the on-ground realities and sort of also great examples that they've seen in communities that actually work. So, for example, we recently spoke with a group that has been instrumental in passing a clean energy fund in Portland, Oregon, that I believe used a tax on retailers to raise a fund, a climate fund that then they are able to deploy into climate and clean energy and energy justice activities, initiatives in the city. And so speaking with them about that setup and how they organized and how they got input and how they're measuring impact, so what kind of metrics they use and how they find out about where their investments would be most impactful is something that we are learning a lot from. So those kind of partnerships, I think, are very valuable.
Great. So going back to one of your previous slides with the US map, for state renewable and clean energy goals that are for 2021 or have passed already, do you know if the states have already met their goals?
Good question. For state renewables goals, I believe the recent ones, I would guess no. I don't know. I know that some early ones, like Iowa, Texas, some of the earliest RPS goals that were set in the country grew fast at their targets. Those are two wind states. Some of our more significant states were wind power, for example. But for the newer targets, I believe those are more ambitious, or based on current baselines and up. So those still need quite a lot of work.
And what project level returns do you usually seek in today's market?
Tricky question. I think it very much depends on your setup, on what you can then take from that project and how you can then structure and bring it to the actual after-tax leverage structured return that your fund needs and allows. But I would say that with the costs decreasing, so if you for technology and even the soft costs around solar, if you look at just the pure revenues and project level expenses, you see high single-digit returns on unlevered basis, or even mid to high.
Thank you. I guess we can wrap up with two last questions. First one is, are there any notable project financing mechanics, references, or manuals that you can recommend?
Project financing manuals. Well, I know that Yale has a great program, and that a couple of my colleagues as well used, but I don't know if those tools are available outside of that. I can't think of any on top of my head. I think if you just dive into some more technical newsletters, you learn more about the sort of transactions as well, so you can get a feel for it that way. But you really, I think you have to get into the depths of the models to understand more.
And on a related note, do you have any recommendations for keeping up with the market and solar news?
Yes, so many sites. Well, sometimes overwhelming to see how much is coming out and at you every day. But a couple of my favorite sources are Green Tech Media, Utility Dive, E&E News. And I would just recommend, if you, especially if you have a target region, to set up alerts or Google Alerts, or even sign up for specific news sources. So there's another one that's regional. I forgot who is the provider. I can look that up and send that over if you guys are interested. But that breaks it down, breaks all these news sources down by region. So you have Northeast, you have Midwest, you have South, and then you have a national one as well. And they might have other regions as well. But a service like that kind of aggregates other sources, so they include the Green Tech Medias and the other, even New York Times and other sort of mainstream media articles as well that are relevant to your interest. And they also disaggregated by technology, solar, electric grid at large, things like that. That's been a very helpful service. I can look for the name and send it over to CB if that's of interest.
Great. And I just want to add that the Clean Energy Finance Forum is another good resource.
Oh, yeah. That's right.
Well, thank you so much, Krisztina, for your time and for sharing your insights with us. That wraps up our Q&A section. And unless you have anything else to say, Krisztina, I think we can conclude this webinar.
Perfect. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Krisztina, and thank you all for joining. Take care.